You all probably remember where you were at certain points in time in your life, and I'm going to tell you about a couple of mine prior to 9/11. My dad actually was at Purdue University, same school I went to. He was in a fraternity, and he was trying to decide on that Sunday afternoon whether to go see a movie or to study, when he walked by a room and he heard over the radio about the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is me in 7th grade. And some people think it was from, looks like Eddie Haskell from Leave It to Beaver. Actually, why am I showing you this photo? Because in 7th grade, I remember distinctly somebody coming into our classroom and telling us that John F. Kennedy had just been shot. Yes, that's me as well. I'm now 17 or 18 years old, I think 18 years old, and I'm working at a camp called Camp Mohawk, which had an Indian theme, and I was an American Indian dance performer. I remember, this is in England, in Europe, because my dad was stationed in the Air Force, he was stationed in Europe, and I worked at this camp in the summertime. And I remember watching this small, black and white, 12-inch screen television of Neil Armstrong setting foot on the moon and saying, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." This is me about 20 years ago when I was the deputy commander of U.S. Army Pacific, and I was stationed in Hawaii. Not a bad gig. Did that for 3 years. But on 9/11, I was actually in Washington, D.C., attending a conference, not in the Pentagon, but hosted by people who were in the Pentagon. They put all of us from around the world that came into this conference. It was about installation management. They put us in the Doubletree Hotel. And the Doubletree Hotel was 2,700 feet from the Pentagon point of impact where the airplane hit. We were in a conference room. It was probably a quarter of the size of this room. It was below ground. And when an airplane hit the first World Trade Center, somebody came in and told us that. And most of us thought, perhaps just like you, that that was a tragic accident. We had no idea what the weather was like in New York or what the air traffic control is done in New York. How did somebody hit the World Trade Center? Well, somebody hit the Empire State Building, bomber during World War II on a training mission. So those kinds of things do happen. But anyway, we stayed with our meeting, and it wasn't very much longer when somebody came in to tell us another airplane has hit the second World Trade Center tower. And we knew then that this was no accident. So we established contact with the Army Operations Center in the Pentagon, so we had an open line with them. We kept meeting there because we had no idea what was going on, but they knew how to contact us. And it wasn't very much longer when somebody ran into the room and said, "There's been an explosion at the Pentagon." They didn't say an airplane hit the Pentagon, they said there's been an explosion. Because an airplane moving that fast, not that many people are going to see it. We learned later that it was an airplane, obviously. We all ran outside. We saw this great big black plume of smoke rising on the other side of 395. You can see 395 right there in the middle, right here. I was standing in this parking lot looking at the smoke that was coming up from the building here, and I pulled out a cell phone and tried to call my wife. Now, this is 20 years ago. Cell phones weren't as good as they are today. You couldn't get through because everybody was trying to use their cell phone at the same time. And I'm not a technologist, but it didn't work. So I ran up to my room in the hotel, and I picked up the phone there, a hard line, and I called my wife in Hawaii. And I said, "Turn the television on." Now it's 4 o'clock in the morning in Hawaii because it's a 6-hour time difference. Turn the television on, and you will see that 2 airplanes have hit the World Trade Center, and something has happened at the Pentagon as well. Please call my headquarters in Hawaii and tell them I'm okay. Because they knew I was attending a conference hosted by the Pentagon, but they didn't know whether it was in the Pentagon or somewhere else. It was actually being hosted where all of us outsiders were staying. And everybody on the staff from the Pentagon was in this hotel from that particular office. There were probably 44, 45 or so people who today would be dead if they didn't convene that meeting on September 11th. Now, why do I say that? Because their offices were right here on the E-ring. And the 2 secretaries that they left back to man the phones while they had this conference were both killed. Just a quirk of fate that they scheduled that meeting on September 11th. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background about the Pentagon itself so you know a little bit about that building. First of all, it was started very eerily, but coincidentally, started construction on September 11th, exactly 6 years to the day before this attack in 1941. And of course, that's before Pearl Harbor, because we saw the winds of war coming. The nation knew that it was going to get into this at this time, at least the senior leadership did. And the Department of Defense, at that time called Department of War, I believe, was scattered all over Washington, D.C. in about 40 different buildings. So they wanted to consolidate it all into one building to make it more efficient, so they decided to build the Pentagon. It was a brick and mortar building, nothing more. Nothing more. And you'll see why that's important here in just a moment. 5 floors, 5 sides, 5 concentric rings. Largest low-rise building in the world, 6 million square feet, 17.5 miles of hallways and corridors. They designed it for efficiency so that people can get around quickly. And if you've ever been in the Pentagon, it's not easy. It's got you almost have to have a map to kind of figure out what the ring is, what the corridor is, what the floor is, and what the room is. They combine all that together to give you the room. And people who are new to the Pentagon often start off about half an hour before their meeting to make sure that they can find it and get there on time. And then after a while, you've been working there, it becomes second nature. 25,000 people work in this building on any given day, and they have an additional 3,000 to 5,000 visitors coming to the building every day. It's affectionately called the Puzzle Palace by those who work there. When I was there in 1996 to 98 doing that job, it was after the Cold War. And the Russians used to come visit the Pentagon. And we would always give them a tour of the National Military Command Center and explain to them how we would respond and how quickly we could respond to make sure they knew that they couldn't launch a surprise attack. How ironic is that? In that 9/11, we had 19 terrorists with nothing more than box cutters and airplane tickets do exactly the same thing, launch a surprise attack. At 8:46 a.m., the first tower was hit. 17 minutes later, the South Tower was hit. 17 minutes, a very short period of time. Now, the airplane that came to Washington, D.C., the first airplane, because there were 2 left in the sky, as you'll recall. The first airplane that came to Washington, D.C. came from the north. And I'm going to show you here in a moment the trajectory that it had. But this is north. This arrow is pointing north. There's the White House right there. Here's the Washington Monument, the ellipse, and the Capitol building is at the far end. Who has flown into National Airport before? You can see the Washington Monument out your window if it's on your side of the airplane. You can see the Capitol. You can see the ellipse. You can see all that stuff. Have any of you ever seen the White House from that airplane? Then you got a pretty good idea, because you can see how small it is. You knew where to look probably. So now you're a 22-year-old terrorist who's never been to Washington, D.C. perhaps, and you just learned how to fly a Piper Cub down in Florida, and you didn't learn how to take off or land, you just learned how to steer it and some basic avionics, and you are coming in to Washington, D.C. at about 3.5 times the speed of what you trained in a great big jet that's much harder to turn than a Piper Cub. And you're coming in from the north. I believe that the airplane that hit the Pentagon was actually targeting the White House, because you'll see its path here in just a second. It came from the north, and it did almost a 320 degree turn, losing altitude as it went around. And eventually, when it got back into this trajectory, it was so low and going so fast, it saw the Pentagon. Pentagon's pretty easy to see because it's a big building as well. And I believe it became a target of opportunity. So they slammed the airplane into the Pentagon because they never did find the White House. Or if they saw the White House, it was too late to turn that airplane, that great big airplane, on a dime to get it into the White House. That's what I believe. The Pentagon was undergoing a renovation on that day, and it had been undergoing a renovation, and many of the people who were in the areas that were being renovated were not in those office spaces because they were being renovated. They were in temporary places in other areas of Washington. But for those that were in the Pentagon, in that newly renovated, and the people that were hosting my conference were back in. They had been moved out, then they had been moved back in, and then they had the conference on that day, so they weren't there. But this was a pretty substantial renovation because the renovation was motivated by the fact that we had seen bombs blowing up buildings over a number of years. We had Khobar Towers, we had Oklahoma City, we had an attempt at the World Trade Center at one time, we had a ship blown up in a port in the Middle East, not blown up, but a hole blown in the side. We knew that a terrorist methodology for attacking the United States was a bomb. And so we said, we're going to harden some of the critical facilities, and one of them was the Pentagon, and the section that had been completed was right here, ironically, exactly where the airplane hit. Now this is important because this section right here on the left-hand side had not yet been renovated. It was still the old World War II era brick and mortar building. This is a photograph that was taken on the day of the attack. You can see the hole in the Pentagon right there, the firemen out here spraying water. And there are windows all along this side of the Pentagon, but you can see there's no fire coming out of here. And it's not because they put the fire out with the water, because you can imagine the thousands of gallons of aviation fuel that got spewed left and right and forward when that airplane hit. And the concussion of the plane hitting the building blew the windows out in the section that was not yet renovated. But I stood about right here looking at windows that were intact right next on either side of the place where that airplane hit, because it was designed to handle an explosion and not have the windows cave in. But the concussion was so great that farther away it blew the windows out, and you can see the fires spread all the way down there. This is the airplane angle, and it came in at a kind of an angle like this. This is the E ring, the outer ring. The rings, 5 rings, are lettered E, D, C, B, A. The interior ring is A, the outdoor ring is E. So it went through the E ring, it went through the D ring, you can see it's right here, and it went partially through the C ring, but it did not go through the B ring, it did not go through the A ring. I believe, I'm not an engineer, but I believe that had it hit any place else on the building, it would have gone through all 5 rings and ended up in the center courtyard. Because again, it was like hot butter or a hot knife going through butter. But because this was steel reinforced concrete and not just bricks and mortar, and the windows had been reinforced, it held up as much as it could. And the death count was low, mostly because there weren't many people on that renovated area, but also because it didn't go all the way through the building like it could have had it hit another side of the building. I have a green circle here to kind of show you where the command and control center was. That's where the Arlington fire chief set up his operation. And let me tell you a couple of things that happened that day, because when I went over there, and I had nothing else to do because I couldn't leave Washington, D.C., so I went over to see what I could do to help. The first place I went was to the Arlington County Fire Chief. And I said, what can the Army provide that would be of help to you? Because those of you who have any experience with fire departments know that first responses are generally led by the fire department. And other agencies are in support of the fire department. They're trying to put out the fire, they're trying to save lives. And all the other agencies, and there were dozens of them there that day from all over. We had them from Maryland, we had them from Virginia, we had federal, we had state, we had local. We had a lot of people there. It was kind of hard to figure out who was in charge. But in the short term, in the morning, when I said, what can the Army provide? He said, I need blocking and bracing material to hold up the sides of the building so we can get in and see who's still alive and rescue them and recover bodies. And also to make sure I protect my firemen who are going to go into this unstable portion of the building. You can see that a portion of the building collapsed here. You can see it on the right-hand side of the hole here. I called the 3rd Infantry Regiment, which is the old guard up at Fort Myer, which is less than a mile away. And I said, look, the fire chief needs blocking and bracing material. Those of you that are in the Army may know that Old Guard has a wartime mission. They are an infantry regiment. They're very good at what they do. Well, they have an engineer company as part of that regiment, and they had blocking and bracing material. So I said to them, can you get that down here as quickly as possible? And they said, yes, we can. Now, about an hour later, somebody got on a megaphone and said, get away from the building, get away from the building. And we all ran to the other side of this highway on the far left-hand side over here. We didn't know why, but when I asked why, somebody said there's another airplane that was coming in. And we didn't know whether it was coming to hit the Pentagon again, and that's the reason. And then they had an all clear, and we all came back, and we sort of forgot about it. So about 30 minutes after that happened, I got in, I was standing next to an FBI agent, and I said, are you aware of any centralized command and control? Because there seems to be an awful lot of people here in charge and not one belly button to push. He said, the Arlington County Sheriff's Department has set up a command van at the Navy Annex, which was about a mile away up on high ground. He said, I'm going up there. Would you like to go? And I said, sure. So he had a SUV straight out of the movies, black, couldn't see through the windows, antennas coming out of the top. I got inside the thing. I sat on the passenger side. He got in the driver's seat, radios everywhere. I said, what do you do? He said, I'm the chief of counterterrorism for the FBI. I said, oh, okay. So we're driving up there, and he says to me, I said something to him about, hey, were you here when they told us to get away from the building? He said, yeah, that was another airplane coming in, and this is really close hold, so don't tell anybody this, but we shot it down. I said, really? He said, yeah, I was headed to Camp David. That's what he told me. The chief of counterterrorism for the FBI. I'm standing next to a different FBI guy when these trucks start rolling in from the right-hand side. And he looks at me, because they're Army trucks, and he said, what are those? I said, those are from the 3rd Infantry Regiment. They're bringing in blocking and bracing material for the police or the fire department. Why do you ask? He said, they're driving over my crime scene. And I said, really? You know, and it just goes to show you the different perspectives that people have. The fire chief was all about putting out the fire, saving lives, recovering the dead. The FBI, and this is no hit on the FBI because they do a lot of great stuff, no question. He was all about preserving the crime scene because there were pieces of airplane that were laying on the ground in front of the Pentagon. And these trucks were driving over the top of some of that stuff. This is Lieutenant Heather Penny. First lieutenant, she was 24 years old, 26 years old. She was in her early 20s. She was a member of the Washington, D.C. National Guard, Air National Guard, F-16 pilot. And she and her squadron commander told her, get in the airplane, we're going up, we're going to stop that airplane that's coming. Because there was a 4th airplane coming. And they didn't have any weapons. So they got into their F-16s and they took off. And they're talking over the radio as they're headed out towards Pennsylvania because the radar has picked up the fact that you've got a 4th airplane coming in. They're talking about how they're going to bring this airplane down. And the squadron commander says, I will go after the front of the airplane, you go after the back. And if you can go to YouTube and see interviews that she has done, you can see that she was going through her head was one, the fact that she didn't think she was going to ever land that airplane again because she was going to crash it into a commercial airliner to make sure it went down. 2, her father, who was an F-4 pilot in Vietnam, was now a commercial airline pilot for United who flew the East Coast. And this was a United airline flight that was coming into Washington, D.C. And she didn't know whether he was in that airplane or not. He wasn't, but she didn't know that at the time. 3, she was trying to figure out, is there any way to survive this? How can I ram my airplane at 500 and something miles per hour into this commercial airline to take it down and survive this? When do I punch out? Do I punch out right before it hits and take a risk of missing the airplane? And then I live with that the rest of my life? Do I wait till there's contact? Will there be enough time for me to punch out of the airplane? Will there be a big explosion? I mean, she didn't know. And so you can imagine the anxiety. But she was convinced that she was going to die on that day. As it turned out, that airline that went down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, was already on the ground before they even took off. That's how slowly this information moved. Now, I can guarantee you there are F-16s or F-22s on strip alert all over the country right now, and the authority to take, that are armed with missiles, and the authority to take down a commercial airline has been delegated when I was in Hawaii 20 years ago, down to the 2-star level. So if we had a commercial airline that was not responding appropriately coming into Honolulu that we suspected might be a terrorist, there was a 2-star Air Force general at Pacific Air Forces who had the authority to order an F-22 or an F-16 to shoot it down. And that is the case now all over the country. So now let's take a little bit look at the intelligence. Why did this happen? How did it fall through the cracks? How did 19 Saudi terrorists, with nothing more than box cutters and airplane tickets, attack 3 targets? Prior to 9/11, 2 of those terrorists were known by the Immigration Naturalization Service as potential terrorists, and they were on the watch list. What does that mean? That means that if they came up to you at a customs site, at an airplane, or at an airport or a seaport, and they gave you a passport that had their photograph and name on it, they would detain them. They were on a watch list. 17 were not on a watch list. But those 2 individuals, and I don't know how they got into the United States, were not caught at a border. They got into the United States, and we didn't know where they were, but they were on the watch list. Nawak al-Zamzi and Khalid al-Midhar. Those 2 individuals purchased their airline tickets on August 25th and August 27th, just a couple of weeks before the attack. Khalid al-Midhar paid cash for his, and Nawak al-Zamzi booked his flight they were both on the airplane that hit the Pentagon. Now you'll see a color coding here in the next couple of slides to show you the connections, kind of the connecting the dots, because what I'm now doing is kind of putting a puzzle together that we were unable to put together on 9/11, but now we do, in retrospect, know how we could have put that puzzle together had we been talking to each other, which we weren't. And these are grouped by airplane. This is the Pentagon airplane, this is the North Tower airplane, this is the South Tower airplane, and then this is the Flight 93 that went into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. You'll see there's only 4 terrorists on that one because the 5th one never made it into the United States. So they went short 1. They had planned for 5 terrorists to be on each airplane. When those 2 individuals purchased their ticket, they used what we will call common address 1 and common address number 2, okay? Green and blue. These 3 individuals purchased their airline tickets. They used those same 2 addresses. So now you have 3 of the terrorists using the same address, one of which is on the INS watch list, 2 of which are not. And then you have one of them on the INS using a second address, and this guy who was not on. You see how it's starting to come together? That had we known how to connect these dots before 9/11, we might have been able to. Mohammed Atta was the ringleader of the entire operation in the United States. We all know it was planned at higher levels in Al-Qaeda, but in the United States, he was the one in charge. Now, when Mohammed Atta purchased his airplane ticket, he used on the purchase at what we will call telephone number 1. These 5 guys also used telephone number 1 when they purchased their airline tickets. So you can see how you could connect these dots. Now you've got them all identified with red circles around their heads. 4 of them on the World Trade Center here, 3 of them on the South Trade Center, 3 of them on the Pentagon. Prior to 9/11, we had what I will call stovepipes of information. Stovepipes mean it stays in that lane. You had federal government, the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, state and local government, science and technology, and the private sector, all stakeholders in the protection of the United States, but not really talking to each other very effectively. After 9/11, and after the 9/11 Commission did their report, they determined that there needs to be a way to pull all this together. So they created the Department of Homeland Security, but it took them 15 months to do that. In the 15 months between 9/11 and the stand-up of the DHS, they had what they call an Office of Homeland Security, which were beg, borrow, and steal personnel and spaces and resources. They didn't have any money. They didn't have any of that stuff. It was a hodgepodge, a Band-Aid-like approach for 15 months. And some would argue that even after 1 March of 2003, they were still trying to find their sea legs, for those of you in the Navy, and figure out what their role was and who to talk to and all that. Very, very complicated task to put your arms around all the security, to make sure that everybody's talking across this way, federal, state, local, and up and down. This is a memorial. Anybody been to the memorial? Okay. It's moving. It is a moving place to be. Each one of these benches represents a victim of that attack. If it is pointing out, it represents a person who was on, or that was in the building, because they were looking out this way. It is pointing towards, you can see this one right here, pointing towards the building like this one and this one. It represents a victim that was on the airplane. And the name of that victim is on that bench. And there's a pool of water, moving water underneath, and a light. And there are trees scattered around. If you are a family member or you knew somebody that was killed in the 9/11 attack, you can go visit their bench. You can sit on their bench. Senator Phil Graham said, "We all lust for the day when the lion and the lamb lie together. But when that day comes, I want to be the lion." If you go to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, there's a sign out front that says, "Peace through strength." And I think the message is, there are tyrants around the world who wish us ill. And the only thing they understand is strength. And so sending a signal to our potential adversaries that you shouldn't mess with the United States because the consequences will be dire is important to do. And that's the reason so many of us, most of you here, if not all of you, feel like I do, I suspect, that we have to have a strong national defense. We have to deter people. That's what kept us from mutually assured destruction during the Cold War. We deterred the Soviet Union from attacking us. And then Reagan came in and did this huge military buildup, and the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. So for decades after World War II, there was great risk of war that peaked a number of times. Cuban Missile Crisis is one of them. Berlin Crisis is one of them. But we were able to deter our adversaries, and we've got to continue to do that.